I didn't hear about this the day it happened. I heard about it years later, after nothing came of it. That's usually how these stories reach me. Not when they're urgent, when they've already been set aside. Elias mentioned it while we were talking about traffic. Nothing dramatic. Just a pause in the conversation that lasted a little too long, he said. There was one drive that didn't make sense. Then he tried to move on. That part mattered more than the story itself. Elias lived in the Bronx at the time. Every weekday morning, he drove south into Manhattan. Saw me route, saw me road. Broadway. If you've driven it, you understand the rhythm. The cross streets are numbered. And as you move south, the numbers go down. 870s, 60s, the city keeps count for you. That morning, his son was in the passenger seat, quiet, looking out the window. No music, no conversation, nothing that would later explain confusion. They passed the 80s like they always did. And then they kept driving. Here's where most people assume something dramatic happened. It didn't know sudden stop, no wrong turn. They were still moving forward when the street sign said 80s again. Sama numbers, Sama buildings, Sama storefronts. At first, Elias assumed it was a mistake. Cities repeat themselves. Your attention drifts. You misread a sign, so he kept driving. They passed the 80s a second time. Then the 70s, then the 60s, then the 50s. Everything returned to the order it was supposed to follow. No correction, no explanation. Just continuation. What matters isn't that it happened. What matters is what didn't happen. Elias didn't stop the car. He didn't say anything to his son, and his son didn't say anything either. They drove the rest of the way in silence. This is usually where fear shows up. It didn't. When they got home, Elias mentioned it to his wife. He didn't frame it as a problem. He said something like, "I think we passed the same streets twice." She said it was strange. Then she told their son to get ready for school and take a shower. And that was the end of the conversation. No replaying the moment. No follow-up questions. No agreement about what it meant. Life moved on without waiting for an explanation. That detail stayed with me. People don't ignore things that scare them. They ignore things that don't fit anywhere. I asked Elias if he was sure his son noticed it too. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, yes, he was looking right at the signs. I asked if they talked about it afterward. He said no. Not later. They never discussed it. That silence wasn't accidental. It was shared. This is the point where most explanations start to feel comfortable. Memory distortion, momentary confusion, fatigue. I thought the same thing, briefly, until I asked Elias a different question. When you saw the 80s again, I said, did you look at your son? He shook his head. I asked why. He said, because if he was seeing it too, then it wasn't just in my head. And if it wasn't real, I didn't want to make it real for him. That answer removed the easy explanations. I didn't investigate this right away. There was nothing to investigate. No danger, no repeat incident, no attempt to understand it. That's important. This wasn't a mystery anyone wanted solved. It was a moment everyone wanted behind them. Months later, I noticed something small. Elias stopped using Broadway, not abruptly, not deliberately. He just didn't take it anymore. When I asked him why, he gave the kind of answer people give when they don't want to examine their own behavior. Traffic, construction, habit. The reasons didn't matter. The pattern did. I drove the route myself. Bronx to Manhattan, north to south. The numbers behaved the way they always had. 80s to 70s, 70s to 60s, 60s to 50s. No repetition, no reversal. I checked maps from that year, construction records, detour notices. Nothing suggested the street numbers could have appeared twice without turning. That didn't mean it was impossible. It meant there was no place to put it. I spoke to Elias's son years later. He didn't remember the drive clearly. That wasn't surprising. I asked him if he remembered anything unusual about Broadway. He said no. Then, after a pause, he added, "I remember the numbers going down. That was all. No memory of them repeating. No sense of something being wrong. Just the expected sequence." That answer was too clean. Memory usually leaves holes. This didn't feel like a hole. It felt like alignment. Two people experienced the same thing and then adjusted themselves around it. There was no footage. No receipts. No timestamps. Nothing physical remained from that morning, which is usually where stories like this end. But this one didn't feel finished. Not because something was unresolved, because something had been contained. Before I closed my notes, I asked Elias one last question. When the street signs repeated, I said, "Did it feel like something was happening, or like something had already happened?" He thought for a long time. Then he said, "It felt like we'd missed something, not lost, just already past it." That answer didn't explain the loop, but it explained the silence. Nothing like it ever happened again. No repeated streets, no reverse numbers, just a road that behaved normally, and two people who never checked with each other about the moment it didn't. By the time I started looking into this properly, nothing was wrong anymore. That's not an exaggeration. There was no ongoing problem. No repeat incident. No urgency. Just a drive that had happened once, and then stopped happening altogether. That makes investigation difficult, because investigation depends on change. And here, everything had already settled. I started with the obvious assumption that something had gone unnoticed. A turn, a detour, a temporary reroute. Cities change quietly, and drivers adjust without remembering when. So I drove the route again, saw my time of day, saw my direction, north to south. The numbers behaved correctly. They always did. That was the first thing that made this harder, not easier. I checked city records from that year. Construction notices, temporary closures, street work, anything that could have caused a loop, even briefly. There was nothing. No detour that rejoined Broadway in the 80s. No signage that redirected traffic north and then south again. Even if there had been, Elias would have noticed. He drove that road every day. Routine builds sensitivity. At this point, most people expect the investigation to escalate, to uncover something hidden. It didn't. Every check returned the same result. Normal. That repetition started to matter. I asked Elias to describe the drive again, not the moment it repeated. The parts before it, where he entered Broadway, which lane he used, how fast he was moving. His answers didn't change. That's usually a warning sign. But not here. There was no effort to convince me. No insistence, just consistency. I asked him about distractions, phone calls, music, conversations. There were none. That made the explanation less comfortable. Distraction is useful. It gives memory something to blame. Here, there was nothing to blame. The simplest explanation was still confusion, a momentary misread. But that explanation collapses under one detail. His son. Children don't politely misremember things for adults. They interrupt, they correct, they ask questions. None of that happened. The silence stayed intact. I asked Elias why that mattered to him. He said something I wrote down immediately. He said, if I'd been alone, I could have let it go. But he was there, and he didn't say anything. That wasn't reassurance. It was the opposite. I tried reconstructing the timeline, not with clocks, with landmarks. The cafe near the corner, the storefront with the faded sign. The bus stopped just before the street changes. All of them appeared in the same order, twice. That's the detail people get stuck on, but repetition alone doesn't explain what came next. After the second pass through the 80s, nothing escalated. No distortion, no confusion. The numbers corrected themselves, and the drive continued, as if the interruption had never happened. That correction is important. If something breaks and stays broken, we notice. If it breaks and fixes itself, we adapt. I looked for anything that changed after that day. Something subtle, a habit, a preference. That's when I noticed Elias stopped using Broadway. Not immediately. Gradually, as if avoiding it without realizing he was doing so. When I pointed it out, he was surprised. He hadn't made a decision. His routine had... I checked his travel logs. Other routes were consistent. Distances matched expectations. Fuel usage aligned normally. Only Broadway was missing. Not flagged, not avoided deliberately. Just absent. That absence didn't prove anything, but it did form a shape. I asked his son about it again. This time, not about the drive, about the road. "What do you think of Broadway?" I asked. He shrugged. "It's just a street." That was the correct answer, but it didn't sit right, because streets usually carry associations. Noise, traffic, stress. This one carried nothing. At this stage, I stopped looking for causes, not because I'd exhausted them, because they weren't producing friction. Everything fit too cleanly. That's when I changed the question. Instead of asking what happened, I asked what adjusted. The answer wasn't the city, it was the people. Elias never checked with his son. His son never asked why. They aligned themselves around the silence. That's not instinct, that's cooperation. I asked Elias if he'd ever tried to bring it up later. He said no, not because he was afraid. Because he didn't know how to begin. There was no language for a moment that didn't leave evidence. By the time I finished my notes, I understood one thing clearly. This wasn't a case where something followed them home. Nothing lingered, nothing repeated, which is exactly why it stayed with them. Most disturbances announce themselves. This one didn't. It arrived, corrected itself, and left behind a change so small it blended into routine. That's harder to reject than fear. I closed the investigation without conclusions, not because I failed to find one, but because the pattern had stopped evolving. Broadway remained a road. The numbers continued to count down, and no one involved ever tried to confirm the moment with anyone else. That silence was stable, and stability, more than explanation, is where these things end. By the time I reached this point, I wasn't looking for answers that had already proven unproductive. Nothing in this case responded to pressure. Nothing surfaced when examined directly. So I stopped treating it like an incident and started treating it like a behavior. When people experience something they don't understand, they usually do one of two things. They either obsess over it, or they quietly reorganize their lives around it. Elias did the second, and once I saw that, the rest of the case changed shape. I reviewed his routine from the months that followed the drive. Not for signs of fear, for adjustments, small ones, routes that changed without explanation, timing that shifted by minutes, preferences that drifted. Nothing dramatic. The most consistent change was still Broadway. It wasn't avoided in a way that drew attention. It simply stopped being selected. When there were two equal options, Elias chose the other one, every time. That pattern didn't appear suddenly. It formed slowly, which made it harder to notice, and harder to question. I asked Elias if Broadway felt different after that day. He said no. That answer was honest, because different implies awareness. This wasn't awareness. It was adjustment without language. I asked him something else. If someone else suggested that route, I said, "Would you object?" He thought about it, then said, "Number, I just take it." That mattered. Avoidance wasn't rigid, it wasn't fear-based, it was passive, which meant it could exist without conscious reinforcement. I turned my attention back to his son. Children don't build long-term avoidance patterns without cause, but they also don't articulate them. They adapt faster than adults and forget the reason why. I asked his son to describe the city, not Broadway. The city, he talked about landmarks, crowds, noise. Then I asked him about numbers. He smiled slightly. Numbers always go down, he said. That was the rule he remembered, not the exception. Rules matter more than events. Events can be dismissed. Rules become framework. And in doing so, it had removed the need to discuss it. I went back to my notes, not to find something I missed, to see what I had stopped writing down. That's often where the shape of a case reveals itself. Early entries were detailed. Time's descriptions, language, latter entries became sparse, observational, then eventually neutral. That shift wasn't accidental. It mirrored the way Elias talked about it. The longer he lived with the memory, the less substance it carried, until all that remained was the decision not to return. At some point, I realized this wasn't a story about repetition. It was a story about correction. Something had deviated, then realigned. And in doing so, it trained two people to behave as if nothing had occurred. That training held, I tried one final approach. I asked Elias if he'd ever wondered whether the moment would have repeated. If he'd stayed on the road longer, he said no, not because he believed it wouldn't, but because he had no interest in finding out. That answer closed more doors than any explanation could have. Most people don't need certainty. They need permission to stop thinking about something. That permission usually comes from consensus. Here, consensus was silence. I asked him whether he thought about the drive anymore. He said only when someone else brought it up, which meant the memory wasn't intrusive. It was dormant. Dormant things don't demand resolution. They demand boundaries. By this point, there was nothing left to investigate, no mechanism to uncover, no timeline to refine, just a completed adjustment, the kind that doesn't announce itself. I reviewed everything one last time, the repeated streets, the lack of reaction, the shared silence, the gradual avoidance. None of it contradicted the others. That was the problem. When things don't contradict, they don't invite correction. They settle, and settled patterns don't feel unresolved. They feel finished. Even when they aren't understood, I stopped taking notes after that. Not because I was satisfied, but because continuing would have meant forcing meaning onto something that had already decided where it ended. The drive never repeated. Broadway remained unchanged. The city continued counting down its numbers, and two people carried on without revisiting the moment when it briefly didn't. Some things don't leave scars. They leave preferences, and those are harder to argue with. There was one thing I hadn't asked, not because it was difficult, because I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Up to this point, every part of the story made a kind of sense. Not logical sense, behavioral sense. Two people experienced something that didn't fit. They didn't react, they didn't discuss it, and then they adjusted their lives around the absence of explanation. That pattern was complete, but one question remained outside of it. I asked Elias if he had ever driven that route again. Not intentionally, not out of curiosity, just accidentally. He said no, not once. That answer was clean, too clean. I asked him if he avoided it on purpose. He said he didn't think so. He never made a rule. He never told himself not to. He just didn't end up there anymore. That distinction mattered. Because decisions leave traces. Habits don't. I asked his son the same question. He didn't remember the drive, but he remembered the route. I asked if he'd ever taken it again. He said he wasn't sure. Then he said something else. He said, "I don't think so." Not confidently, not defensively, as if the idea itself didn't quite belong to him. At that point, there was nothing left to test. No variables, no timelines, just a completed adjustment shared by two people who never coordinated it. That kind of alignment doesn't require memory. It requires agreement. I reviewed the records one last time. Maps, routes, logs, everything behaved as expected. Nothing pointed backward. Nothing looped. Nothing acknowledged the deviation, which meant the deviation had been absorbed. That's when I noticed something I hadn't been looking for. Not in the city. In the data, Elias kept basic travel logs at the time. Nothing detailed, just distances, fuel use, general routes. Most of it was unremarkable. Except for one thing, the average distance recorded for the Broadway route didn't disappear. It remained in the system. Even after the route itself stopped appearing in his records, month after month, the average stayed current, adjusted, as if it were still being used. There were no new entries, no recorded drives, no timestamps to attach it to. Just a number that continued to behave as though it had input. That shouldn't have been possible. But it also didn't prove anything. I checked the rest of the data. Other routes behaved normally. When they weren't used, their averages froze. Broadway's didn't. It kept updating. Quietly, I asked Elias about it. He had no explanation. He hadn't noticed. He wasn't concerned. The number didn't affect his life. It just existed. I considered possible errors, software, quirks, carryover data, rounding artifacts. All of them were plausible. None of them fit cleanly, but none of them needed to. The system wasn't broken. It was consistent. At that point, I stopped asking questions, not because the answers were frightening, because they weren't. Everything was calm, orderly, stable. That was the unsettling part. The drive never repeated. No one else reported anything similar. Broadway continued doing what roads do. The numbers went down. The city remained intact. But the record didn't reset, and no one thought to ask it to. I closed the file after that. Not because it was solved, but because it wasn't changing. And things that don't change don't announce when they're finished. They just remain. Sometimes, the most disturbing part of an incident isn't what happened. It's what kept behaving as if it still mattered, long after everyone involved had moved on. I never followed up again. Neither did they. And nothing ever forced the issue. Which means, as far as anyone was concerned, the loop was over.